Hello, everyone, and welcome to another college basketball conference preview edition of the Zach Kroll Sports Podcast. Today is Tuesday of Champ Week, and I am here today to record another conference preview edition of this podcast. In case you missed it, over the last couple of days, I have recorded full previews of the ACC, the Pac-12, the Big East, and the SEC, and right here, right now, I'm going to be doing the Big Ten. Later tonight, I will be doing the Big 12, and then I'm just going to sit back, enjoy Champ Week, share some thoughts and observations with you guys on Twitter as we get ready and closer and closer and closer to Selection Sunday. So the conference I'm going to be talking about today, once again, is the Big Ten. Now, the first thing that comes to mind about this Big Ten tournament is the fact that it is in Indianapolis. Not only is it in Indianapolis, it is at Lucas Oil Stadium. This could be, I believe, the first time I ever remember watching a full conference tournament take place at a football stadium. Usually those are reserved for the Final Fours and the Elite Eight, Sweet 16s of the world. But it is something new that we're going to have to see how it is during COVID. And a lot of the Big Ten teams, Indianapolis is not too far away. It's also going to be the destination of the NCAA tournament, so we'll see maybe if any of the teams playing here in the Big Ten tournament at this event could get a little bit used to playing with these kinds of rims and playing in a football stadium, and we'll see if they get used to that and if that will get to their advantage if, God forbid, they end up making it all the way to the national championship game. But before I start off, I just wanted to give you guys a quick rundown of what I do on these conference previews. Basically, what I'm going to be doing is going over each and every game in the conference tournament, and I'll be giving you guys predictions. Along with those predictions, I'll be giving you guys full analysis on each and every team in this league, how I think they did this season, how, if you are a fan of that team, you should be feeling heading into next season. I do believe always that conference tournament is very important because of that. You want to see if you could create some momentum heading into next season or create some momentum heading into the NCAA tournament if you play on playing there. And I think in this Big Ten, one of the storylines of this league has just been how many good teams there are in this league, and it is pretty cool to see all of them at one spot here at the Big Ten tournament in Indianapolis. The other thing I do on these conference preview shows, in case you want to play along at home, you guys know how each conference gives out awards. So I decided I would do the same thing. I'm going to be giving out awards for my player of the year in the Big Ten, my coach of the year in the Big Ten, my freshman of the year in the Big Ten, my biggest disappointment in the Big Ten in terms of a team, the most improved player in the Big Ten, and my 5 first-team all-conference selections in the Big Ten. If you want to play along at home, you could do that. I know the Big Ten was one of the conferences whose awards actually dropped this morning, and there were actually some people that weren't too happy with the way they went. So hopefully, if you are a Big Ten fan and listening to this, you will be a little bit happier with my picks. But without further ado, let's get to it. Game number 1, here we go. It will be between the number 13 seeded Minnesota Golden Gophers, and yes, you heard that right, the number 13 seeded Minnesota Golden Gophers. They will be taking on the number 12 seeded Northwestern Wildcats, and both of these teams actually do have a lot in common in the sense that they both have went through roller coaster seasons. And I know when I've been recording these conference preview podcasts, that has been a common thing that I've said a lot about some of these teams in this Big Ten and other teams around the Power 6 in college basketball. But I think Minnesota is a team that really does demonstrate that. I actually was pretty high on the Gophers heading into the season. I think the way they played early on in the season was really the way I expected them to play throughout the season, to be honest with you. And last year, it was a little bit of a disappointing season for Minnesota, but I do think there were reasons for Gopher fans to be optimistic heading into this season when you look at the fact that they returned some really good guards like Marcus Carr and Gabe Kalsher, along with one of the best and most impactful transfers in all of college basketball, Leon Robbins from Drake. I actually think that Minnesota actually had a chance to be really good. They also brought in Brandon Johnson, who was their leading, most efficient scorer from the field. And the Golden Gophers, it's crazy how this team is not only not going to make the NCAA tournament, but the fact that they are not even going to come close to making the NCAA tournament unless they go on a big run here in the Big Ten tournament in Indianapolis. And let me tell you why. Minnesota had many really good wins early in the season, whether it was a big-time home win against St. Louis. I understand the Billikens ended up right now, they're on the wrong side of the bubble, but at the same time, they're a good basketball team in the numbers and the metrics perspective. That actually is a pretty good win. They had a home win against Iowa. They had a home win against Michigan. They had a home win against Ohio State. Think about just how good those 3 wins are. Oh yeah, they also beat Purdue, who is the number 4 seed in the Big Ten. Think about that for a second. Minnesota beat really 4 of the 5 best teams in one of the best Big Tens we've seen in a very long time, and they have lost 7 games in a row to end the season. And that is why they have not come close to making the NCAA tournament this year. Since that win against Purdue, they lost to Maryland. They lost to Indiana. Both of those games on the road, fine. Lose at home to Illinois, fine. But then you lose at home to Northwestern. Then you lose on the road to Nebraska. Then you lose on the road to Penn State. And I think when we see that pattern starting to happen, that is when people like myself, who going into the season were actually defenders of Richard Pitino, there's nothing we could say anymore, dude. This guy has too much talent to have this team this bad and going into the Big Ten tournament losing 7 games in a row. Now, the one thing I will say about Minnesota is I did watch them up close and personal on Saturday against Rutgers, and the Scarlet Knights really were winning throughout the game, most of the game, I should say. And Minnesota actually did come back, force the game to overtime. They hit a 3 basically at the buzzer to send it to overtime. Rutgers still ended up getting the dub. But I still feel like the players are fighting for Richard Pitino. He has coached most of them for 4 years, or whether it's a year or 2 for the transfers. But I do think he is a player-friendly coach. I don't think he is necessarily the best coach and most efficient coach when it comes to winning games. But he did lead Minnesota to a couple NCAA tournament appearances. He did win one NCAA tournament game with the Gophers. It was against Louisville during the first round of the last NCAA tournament. And I do think it's unfortunate because when you look at Minnesota, this team had the pieces to be very good, and they had the pieces to be an NCAA tournament team. I think that we were really able to see that, quite frankly, when they played Michigan and when they played Ohio State, when they played Purdue, and they looked pretty good in those games. But unfortunately, over the last 7, everything has really fallen apart for this Minnesota Golden Gophers squad. And if you're a Gophers fan, you draw Northwestern in the first round. I think it's a game where, okay, that's where you start. Northwestern was really the first team that had me really concerned about Minnesota. That Northwestern beat Minnesota by 8, and that was when I was like, wow, Minnesota and the Gophers, they may really be in trouble. If Minnesota wants any hope of turning it around, this is going to be the place they're going to have to start against Northwestern. Now let's get into Northwestern a little bit. The Wildcats, they finished as the number 12 seed in the Big Ten. They will actually be the home team in this matchup with a conference record of 6-13. They beat out Minnesota by half a game in that sense. And I feel like Northwestern is another team that early in the season, I actually had myself complimenting Chris Collins and giving him credit. And if you've listened to this show, you know that really besides that one tournament run where the whole media was bowing down to Chris Collins because he got the program to their first NCAA tournament in the history of the school, and that was a really nice job. I will admit, he does deserve a lot of credit for that. But at the same time, the year after that, they returned everyone from that same team, and they were just an awful, awful basketball team, not even sniffing the NCAA tournament. The last 2 years, Northwestern has really had trouble closing out games. They have lost a lot of close games, and one of the reasons why I was critical of Chris Collins was because early in the season, they were actually losing a lot of very close games. However, they did go through a really nice stretch in early Big Ten play, where they beat Michigan State, they beat Indiana, and they beat Ohio State. And I remember there was a week where I actually had Northwestern ranked in my top 25. And keep in mind, I had this Wildcat team, just like about everyone, finishing at the bottom of the Big Ten. But at the same time, just when I was willing to give Chris Collins credit, he lost, let's count them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 Big Ten games in a row until he finally beat Minnesota on the road. That just tells you all you need to know about how bad the Minnesota Golden Gophers have been playing of late. They lost to Northwestern, and that win made for the first Wildcats win in 13 games, 13 tries. Crazy stuff if you are a fan of Northwestern. And it's unfortunate because I do think a lot of the reasons why Northwestern lost all those games in a row is because the Big Ten is a really good league. It's not like any of the losses they took were necessarily bad. Here's the problem, though. If you want me to support you as a coach, you have to at least win 1, 2, or 3 of these games. I'm not sitting here and telling you that the reason why I'm not the biggest fan of Chris Collins as a coach is because he's not winning Big Ten championships for Northwestern, or he's not getting the Northwestern Wildcats to the NCAA tournament each and every year. No, I'm not even expecting him to do that. I just want him to make Northwestern somewhat relevant. And I remember when I was talking about the SEC in the preview pod with that conference, I mentioned how in 2017, Frank Martin was able to get South Carolina to the Final Four. And there was a hot second where South Carolina was all of a sudden one of the hottest things in college basketball. And Frank Martin, I don't think, did a good enough job capitalizing off that opportunity and getting high-level recruits to come to South Carolina because of that Final Four run. I understand Northwestern isn't the best basketball program. They don't have much history besides that one team. But I think we can make an argument that Chris Collins didn't capitalize enough either. Now, Northwestern, they've had some good, solid players come into their program. I like Miller Kopp. I like Chase Audige. I like Pete Nance, Boo Buie. These guys are actually pretty solid players. The problem is, even though Northwestern has improved from a talent perspective over the last couple of years, so has everyone in the Big Ten, and the other teams in the Big Ten, as we all know, are on just such a higher level when you compare them to the Northwestern Wildcats. Now, I know Northwestern beat Minnesota, and that was the game that ended their long, long losing streak. But with that being said, I'm going to take the Minnesota Golden Gophers to get the win over Northwestern in Game 1, Round 1 of this Big Ten tournament. Now, I do think that the players are going to play hard for Richard Pitino, and I think they like him a lot. I heard some stuff about Richard Pitino letting the team know in the locker room before it was really public to everyone that most likely he is just not going to be the head coach of the Minnesota Golden Gophers next year. He was really telling the kids, just enjoy college, enjoy these crazy times. The fact that we're playing basketball right now in the midst of a pandemic, we are super fortunate to be doing this. But at the same time, the season has just fallen apart for Minnesota. I think they have one good memory left. I think in Game 1, they get the dub over Northwestern. Okay, moving on to the next matchup in the Big Ten. This will be between the number 14 seeded Nebraska Cornhuskers and the number 11 seeded Penn State Nittany Lions. And here's what I'll say about this one. Let's start with Nebraska. And I think when we look at the Cornhuskers, I believe that they are in a very similar spot to Northwestern, in the sense that I do think when they hired Fred Hoiberg, that was about as good of a hire as they were ever going to make. We all know the great work that Fred Hoiberg was able to do while he was the head coach of the Iowa State Cyclones, and he was really able to turn around that culture quickly. But at the same time, this guy was so well liked around Iowa State. They have much better resources than a school like Nebraska, who is more known as a football school. And Tim Miles, he did a good job, but unfortunately, he just never was really able to break through. And I think all Nebraska fans kind of knew it was ultimately going to be time for a change sooner rather than later. So they decided to hop on a coach that used to coach in the NBA. And one thing I will say about Coach Hoiberg is this. Going into the season, he was able to bring in some talent. Teddy Allen, Trey McGowens, Delano Banton, those three guys straight off the bat are three really good basketball players, and they were three of the better transfers on the market this past season. At the same time, Lat Mayen is a guy who played much more and was much more impactful than any Nebraska fan could have ever expected. Kobe Webster, Derek Walker, Shamal Stevenson. So the point I'm trying to make here, Fred Hoiberg actually started doing the same thing that he was doing at Iowa State at Nebraska by bringing in transfers. Unfortunately, though, in a COVID offseason, and I'm not using that as an excuse. Obviously, I think if we were in a normal season, I'm not saying that Nebraska was going to be an NCAA tournament team or anything like that. But at the same time, I do think that Nebraska, they were in trouble from the start. And I think when you have all of these transfers, it is hard to develop that chemistry in a COVID offseason, and especially when you're playing in such a tough league like the Big Ten. As much as I love Teddy Allen, who, by the way, is no longer with the team, which isn't a great sign for Nebraska going into this Big Ten tournament, then they never really had a shot to begin with. Now, Nebraska did pick up some decent wins throughout Big Ten play, including a home win against Minnesota, a home win against Rutgers, and not only was it a home win, but they beat Rutgers by 21 points, and that is a Rutgers team we're obviously going to get into a little bit later, but they're going to be playing in the NCAA tournament most likely, so we'll see what ends up going on there. And then they won at Penn State, which was an impressive win as well. That is a tough place to play where many good teams have lost. And they will be taking on Penn State in round 1 of this Big Ten tournament. And when you look at Nebraska, it's unfortunate because I do think Northwestern has some young talent that when you compare these two teams, and I think it's appropriate to do so because they are the two teams that really over the last couple of years have been really consistently in the bottom dweller of this Big Ten. And whether you want to say it's because of just how tough the league has been, whether you want to say it's just these two programs don't have the resources, or just flat out these two programs aren't necessarily as good as some of the other teams in the Big Ten, I don't really know what to tell you because Nebraska has just been really, really irrelevant over the last couple of years when it comes to basketball. And it's unfortunate because there is talent on this team. Just when you compare it to some of the other talent around the Big Ten, it really isn't close. And if I'm a Nebraska fan going into next season, you hope Delano Banton and you hope that Lat Mayen could be the two guys that could really take off and lead this team. Another guy that had a pretty disappointing season for Nebraska was Yvonne Oydragu, the sophomore from France. He was very good as a freshman, and he really at some moments fell out of the rotation this year. I'm also a huge fan of Trey McGowan's. I actually just finished up watching Pitt and Miami, and you could tell that his absence and his decision to leave the Pitt Panthers program has definitely affected them, and he hasn't necessarily gone out to Nebraska and have lived up to the expectations that I thought of him. So if those guys could just keep on getting better, if you're a Nebraska fan, hopefully you could go into next season with some momentum. But it has been a rough time if you are a fan of Nebraska Cornhusker basketball. They will be taking on the number 11 seeded Penn State. And Penn State was a team that was actually in the news pretty early during this college basketball season because their head coach, Pat Chambers, actually did not return, and he made that decision very late in the offseason. So they decided to bring in head coach Jim Ferry. He used to be at Duquesne. It is most likely known all around the college basketball community that Ferry is not going to be the head coach at Penn State. When I was considering the candidates, there were a couple guys that stood out. James Jones from Yale, I think, would be a pretty solid hire. Same with Mark Schmidt of St. Bonaventure. Those are the two guys instantly that came to mind. And I do think when you look at Jim Ferry and the job that he's done as an intern coach so far this season, it's not like he's done a bad job, but it's not like he's also done anything to necessarily convince the Penn State administration to bring him back. The Nittany Lions are entering this Big Ten tournament at 10-13 overall, 7-12 in the Big Ten, with a few questionable in-game coaching decisions foretelling the team's downfall in a few of their very close losses. I do think that, like watching Penn State the other night against Maryland up close, they actually played really well. And Seth Lundy is a player that I think has a high ceiling if he could just stay in school and keep on getting better. Myrian Jones is one of the more underrated players in the Big Ten. He is consistently a bucket getter for Penn State, putting up 17 in their win against Maryland. And keep in mind, like, Maryland is going to be an NCAA tournament team. We're obviously going to get into them a little bit later on and how good of a job I think Mark Turgeon has done as the head coach of Maryland. But at the same time, when you look at it, Penn State as a team, I think they're kind of in that same boat as in Northwestern and Nebraska, but a little bit better. Now, Penn State, they have been consistent over the last couple of years, even when Pat Chambers was there. Unfortunately, they were never really able to make the NCAA tournament, but at the same time, I feel like especially going back the last 3 or 4 years, every time a good team in the Big Ten came to the Bryce Jordan Center, they would always be somewhat competitive. Even this season, in a bad year, they were able to go to Virginia Tech, who is the number 3 seed in the NCAA tournament, is going to be a 6 or 7 seed in that NCAA tournament as well. And they beat them by 20. They also were able to go toe-to-toe against Wisconsin at home and win, and beat Maryland at home and on the road. They also were able to beat Minnesota at home, and I do think Jim Ferry hasn't done an awful job, but at the same time, once again, I don't think he's done enough for me to necessarily say, okay, I want to bring him back as the next head coach of Penn State. Isaiah Brockington is the other kid for the Penn State Nittany Lions that I think so far this season has really been stepping up for them. The transfer from St. Bonaventure has been pretty good, averaging 12.7 points per game, 4.7 rebounds per game, and 1.7 assists per game. I think a top 3 of Jones, Brockington, and Lundy isn't necessarily bad. They also have a kid that comes off the bench, Sam Sessions, the Binghamton transfer. I actually like him. He could get buckets in a hurry. He hasn't had too much trouble, I don't think, adjusting to the level of the Big Ten from the America East, but he's done everything we've really, I think, expected him to do so. And Penn State, John Hurrah, that's the other big guy they have. He's a very good rebounder, averaging 8.5 rebounds per game. And Penn State, once again, they were very, very competitive in their home games that not a lot of people necessarily expected them to win this season. And even in some road games, once again, I was super impressed with what Seth Lundy was able to do the other night in their win against Maryland. But right now, if you're a Penn State basketball fan, I think your number one focus has to be locking in on who your next head coach is going to be. The 2 candidates that come to mind for me right away, once again, are Mark Schmidt of St. Bonaventure and James Jones of Yale. With the coaching carousel in a COVID offseason, it's going to be interesting to see how or if this carousel is handled any differently than any other ones of the past. But I will say this, I do think Penn State does beat Nebraska. I do think that Penn State's top 3, I just saw them go into Maryland and pull off a very impressive win. Nebraska just hasn't shown me enough that they could go and beat even a Penn State team that isn't necessarily anything special, but Nebraska has just had a lot of trouble winning basketball games. So in round 1, I'm going to take Minnesota over Northwestern. I have them moving on to take on the 5-seed Buckeyes, and then I have the number 11 seed Nittany Lions of Penn State beating 14 seed Nebraska, moving on to take on Wisconsin. Okay, moving on to the next game in the Big Ten. Let's go to the very famous 9-8 game, and I'm not going to lie to you folks, of all of the games in this Big Ten tournament, I do believe that this 9 versus 8 matchup could be the best game that we see, and it will be the number 9 seed Michigan State Spartans that out of nowhere all of a sudden have made their way into the NCAA tournament field. I have them on the right side of the bubble right now. They will be taking on the number 8 seeded Maryland Terrapins, and I have a lot to say about both of these teams. And let's start off with Michigan State. Now, the one thing about the Spartans was this. I had them finishing 5th in the Big Ten before the season started, and a lot of people before the season would have considered that, if you are a Michigan State fan in particular, a disappointing season. But at the same time, when you look at just how much talent Michigan State had on their squad last year, and the fact that it's not back, Cassius Winston and Xavier Tillman were 2 of the better players in Michigan State history honestly, the impact they've made throughout their college careers were both very, very impactful. Great careers. Cassius Winston especially. He was just such a special player. And really, since Magic Johnson, Mateen Cleaves, he's in that same kind of mold in terms of the legends to come out of that Michigan State Spartans program. And Michigan State, this season, especially early, they struggled because they looked like a team, exactly that. They looked like a team that lost a lot of talent, that was playing in a COVID offseason, didn't really have that much time to get the chemistry down packed. And Michigan State, they started 6-0, including a road win against Duke, but then they suffered a little bit of a losing streak, losing to Northwestern, losing to Wisconsin, losing to Minnesota, and then another big 4-game losing streak with a COVID pause in the middle, losses against Purdue, losses against Rutgers, Ohio State, Iowa. But they have been playing much better basketball since the start of February. Since February 3rd, they have a record of 7-4. And I understand that's not great, but when you consider just how bad Michigan State was playing during the early portion of the Big Ten schedule, and the fact that the Big Ten is a really tough league, and playing in such a tough league like that comes with its blessings and comes with its curses. And let me explain to you what I mean. You could have a team like Minnesota, who started off their season great, coming up with some big-time wins early in the Big Ten slate, which at the time we thought had catapulted them into the NCAA tournament picture. But at the same time, we've seen that going into March Madness, they really have not been trending in the right direction, and you cannot have a team that's lost 7 games in a row in the tournament picture whatsoever. But Michigan State, they have used the Big Ten and the tough schedule to their advantage, because let's face facts. In early February, Michigan State, they had lost to Iowa. They had lost to Purdue. They were dead. They were 4-9 in Big Ten play at the time, and 10-9 overall, which if you're a fan of the Michigan State Spartans, that is obviously a huge, huge disappointment, no matter how much talent you lose. But since then, Michigan State has catapulted their way into the tournament, and that run that they're on right now, it really started with their big win against Indiana at Assembly Hall. The Hoosiers are another team in this Big Ten that I just cannot wait to talk about. We're obviously going to get into them a little bit later on in the show as well. But Michigan State went into Assembly Hall on Saturday, February 20th, and won by 7. And I remember saying to myself, it is literally the least surprising thing in the world that Michigan State just went into Indiana and won this game, considering really just how inconsistent both of these teams have been. But Michigan State has been able to use the momentum they got from that big-time comeback victory they had against Indiana, and they've beaten Illinois, who is going to be most likely a number 1 seed in the NCAA tournament. They were able to beat Ohio State. They were able to beat Indiana, and oh yeah, they were able to beat Michigan the other day, their rival, who is also most likely going to be a number 1 seed in the NCAA tournament. And oh yeah, here's the other thing. Michigan beat them a couple days before by 19 points, and I love how once March comes around, a coach like Tom Izzo instantly has his guys ready to play. He doesn't care that they lost by 19 the day before. He says, all right, guys, they got the best of us this day. Let's get the best of them the next time we see them on our home floor. And I was very impressed with how Michigan State was able to handle Michigan on Sunday in the win. They also did a really good job on Hunter Dickinson defensively, one of the better jobs and efforts I've seen on him all season. And I think if you are a Spartan fan, the encouraging thing about the win on Sunday against Michigan was that a lot of guys were really able to step up. I loved what Rocket Watts has been doing over the last couple games. He was a sleeper for me before the season started to actually win Big Ten Player of the Year. Unfortunately, it hasn't really gone that way, considering that Michigan State's season didn't necessarily get off to the best start. But at the same time, he comes off the bench on Sunday against Michigan, plays 33 minutes, and has 21 points. and shot 8 of 16 from the field, 50%. Super impressive effort by him. Joey Hauser had a couple big threes. Josh Langford only had 7 points, but he was able to hit the dagger. And I think finally, when you look at Michigan State, they're another team that going into the season, we always knew they had a lot of talent, but we could tell early on the chemistry was not there. They were not on the same page. They didn't necessarily know who was the top dog in their lineup. And I've been really impressed also with Aaron Henry and what he's been able to do over the last couple weeks as well. He has taken over as that main primary ball handler for Michigan State, along with Rocket Watts, who I think is better off the ball, and he's finally recently really adjusting to being that go-to point guard for the Michigan State Spartans, and he's been really fun to watch over the last couple games as well. And Aaron Henry has as well, too. And Aaron Henry has been a guy that, if you've listened to this show long enough, you know I've actually been not his biggest fan. I've been a little bit critical of him, and he was good as a freshman on the teams that beat Zion and Duke and had Cassius Winston and had Nick Ward, all those guys. And he has been really good over the last couple weeks. He has been playing the best basketball of his career. And for the first time as a basketball fan, when I'm watching Michigan State play, I feel comfortable with the ball in his hands late in a game. Michigan State had some point guard issues early in the season as well. I think they are doing a really nice job finally being able to solve some of those problems. Michigan State's been playing some really good basketball right now. I have them as the first team playing in Dayton. I do think if they win this first game of the Big Ten Tournament against Maryland, who we'll get into in a second, I think they are going to end up safely outside of Dayton and on the right side of the bubble. So, the team Michigan State will be taking on will be the team that beat Michigan State, actually, a couple weeks ago. That will be Mark Turgeon and his Maryland Terrapins. And I have actually spoken a decent amount about Mark Turgeon and the Terrapins on this show over the last couple of years, and I'll explain why. So, Mark Turgeon at Maryland, I never necessarily thought that he was a bad coach. I just thought he was the poster boy of a guy who used his school and his resources to his advantage and was able to recruit talent, which gave him enough wins to satisfy the fan base for the most part. And really, over the last couple of years, the Maryland fans have been kind of catching on and realizing, okay, maybe Mark Turgeon isn't really the guy to be leading us to the promised land, because I'm not saying that he's a bad coach, but prior to this season, I had never really seen him overachieve as the head coach of Maryland. And last year, I was very skeptical about Maryland throughout many points of the season. I love Anthony Cowan, I love Jalen Smith, but really, since Mark Turgeon has taken over in College Park, he has lost so many games that, quite frankly, he just had no business at all losing. And I think when you look at the Maryland Terrapins going into this season in such a tough league like the Big Ten, I remember saying on this show last year that out of any team in college basketball, Maryland got screwed the most by them not having the tournament last year, because I actually thought if Maryland was ever going to make it to the Final Four, last year was going to be the year. I thought the way Anthony Cowan and the way Jalen Smith was playing down the stretch, really looking like a true NBA player, along with a lot of the guards they have now that are succeeding, who we're going to get into in a little bit, I really thought that last year could have been the season for Mark Turgeon and the Maryland Terrapins to go on a deep run in the NCAA tournament. And I do think, for Turgeon's sake, that would have actually shut up the fans a little bit in College Park, in the process taking some pressure off of his own back, because let's face it, Maryland fans, as I said earlier, have really, I thought, started to catch on to Mark Turgeon, and really prior to the season, the statement that he wasn't necessarily the best coach. But with that being said, I do want to give Mark Turgeon credit, because I do think that Maryland and the coaching job that Mark Turgeon has done this season has been the best job since he's gotten to College Park. And let me tell you why. I remember watching Maryland early on in this college basketball season, and I saw them play Clemson, and they lost by 16, and let me tell you something. The game wasn't even that close. I saw them play Rutgers. They lose by 14 at home. They lose to Michigan. They lose to Indiana. They lose to Iowa. And I was just not feeling very good about this Maryland Terrapins team at all. But then all of a sudden, they beat Wisconsin. They beat Illinois. Both of those games on the road. And we know that prior to a couple seasons ago, Mark Turgeon would never, ever beat ranked teams on the road. And he did that twice when no one really expected him to do that this season. I think the Terps have done a nice job of using that momentum they gained and that confidence from, okay, we could win on the road. They've beaten Minnesota on the road. They beat Purdue at home. They beat Minnesota at home. They beat Rutgers on the road. They beat Michigan State at home. And this is a Maryland team that has been much better than I could have ever expected, especially with the losses of two very good players like Anthony Cowan and Jalen Smith. I'm a big fan of Eric Ayala. He is Maryland's leading scorer. He's averaging 14.5 points per game, 4 rebounds, 2.2 assists per game, shooting 34.3% from three. Aaron Wiggins is the other big go-to guy for this Terrapin squad. He averaging 14 points per game, 30.8% from three. Donta Scott, 11.2 points, 6.4 rebounds. And Donta Scott is one of the main reasons why I think Maryland is really good. He is their leading rebounder at 6.4 rebounds per game. And he is one of the more improved players in not only the Big Ten, but all of college basketball. Unfortunately, when it comes to the awards, there are so many different candidates to win them. So we'll see who goes out to them, and there have been no recipients of any awards of the handful of Big Ten teams that I have gone over so far. But Maryland has done a really good job. I do think that they're going to be an NCAA tournament team. I do think that they are going to avoid Dayton. And like Michigan State, they have done a really good job of using the toughness of a conference like the Big Ten to their advantage. And they have picked up enough quality wins throughout the season to put themselves in a good position to make the NCAA tournament. With that being said, I'm going to take Michigan State to get the job done and beat Maryland. I like the way the Spartans are playing, and I think Rocket Watts and I think Josh Langford and Joey Hauser, they have enough firepower to get by this Maryland team. I do think that both of these teams are very evenly matched. I think that these 8-9 games in a lot of these conference tournaments are going to make for some of the most fascinating basketball that we will see throughout Champ Week. They're so even matched, and I cannot wait. Maryland got the best of them early on in College Park. I think Michigan State does just enough to get one back and beat Maryland and move on to take on their rival, Michigan. Moving on to the next matchup in the Big Ten tournament, I told you that I predicted the number 13 seeded Minnesota Golden Gophers to move on to the next round and take on the Ohio State Buckeyes, the number 5 seed. And let's talk a little bit about Ohio State. The Buckeyes are another team that has had a roller coaster season. And I remember early on in this season saying, wow, Chris Holtmann should be in the conversation for National Coach of the Year. I feel like we're out here saying this about him every single year. He has done such a good job since he has taken over as the head coach of Ohio State, and he's really overachieved compared to expectations. Now, unfortunately, the one common theme that we have seen for Ohio State over the last couple of years is once we start to give them credit and once we start to say, wow, these guys really overachieved so far, just imagine what else they could do, that's when they really start to struggle. And really, the same exact thing happened to the Buckeyes this year. On Thursday, February 18th, they went into Penn State and put up 92 points. They won 92-82. And after that win, their overall record was 18-4. Their conference record is 12-4. And they were looking like one of the best stories in college basketball. And they still are, by the way. They're going to be probably a number 2, or if things unravel, a number 3 seed. They've had a really nice season, but they were on the 1 seed line at one point pretty comfortably, including after that loss against after that win against Penn State. They then lose to Michigan at home, lose to Michigan State on the road, lose to Iowa at home, lose to Illinois at home. And once again, I'm not out here crushing the Buckeyes. There is not a bad loss in that mix. That is why playing in a league like the Big Ten is so tough, because literally each and every night is a game that if you don't come prepared and ready to play, you are going to lose. And Ohio State is going to go into this Big Ten tournament as losers of 4 games in a row. And you obviously want to see them beat Minnesota, which would be a pretty bad loss if they don't, when you consider the fact over the last couple weeks, Minnesota, as we've spoken about earlier, has not been playing very good basketball at all. So I do like Ohio State to beat Minnesota. I think this is where Richard Pitino's official run as the coach of the Gophers comes to an end. So I'm going to take Ohio State to win. But I really want to see Ohio State blow out these Gophers. I want to see Ohio State look like the team we saw go into Iowa City and beat the Iowa Hawkeyes. I want to see the Ohio State Buckeyes team we saw go into Maryland and win, and go into Wisconsin and win. Not the team we saw really struggle to make big plays down the stretch against Illinois on Sunday, or the team that got blown out by Iowa a couple weeks ago. Now, if you are an Ohio State fan, there is some good news. I did pick, E.J. Liddell, your star forward, as one of the 5 members of my first-team all-conference squad, and this kid is an absolute bucket. I didn't necessarily pick him to make the first-team all-conference squad prior to the start of the season, but when you watch Ohio State play, it is evident that all of their offense flows directly through him, and he is just so important and so valuable to this team. This is the other thing I do like about Ohio State. They are very experienced. Their top 3 of E.J. Liddell, Dwayne Washington, and Justice Suing are all multi-year college players. They're all pretty good offensive players as well. C.J. Walker, Kyle Young. I'm a fan of Justin Arns. I think that he could be an underrated piece for Ohio State going forward. He is really their main threat from the outside shooting, along with Dwayne Washington. The other kid I really like for this Ohio State team, a name to remember, is Zed Key. Lou High kid, Long Island Lutheran, from my neck of the woods, and he is a guy that hasn't necessarily gotten that much of a chance, only plays 9.4 minutes per game, playing behind very experienced guys like Liddell and Kyle Young, Musa Jallow as well, getting a lot of good run out there for the Buckeyes. But at the same time, I do think that Ohio State is deep. They have many different guys they could go to. They even have some younger guys like Michi Johnson and Eugene Brown that I think, if their name is called, they could make a couple big shots, and they have some really nice, bright futures ahead. But Ohio State is just a tricky team to go into this Big Ten tournament with any feel for, because they should beat Minnesota. But then against Purdue, if they win, that's who they would play. That is going to be a big time matchup, and Purdue actually went into Value City Arena and beat Ohio State. They played in Mackey Arena, and Purdue won both times. We're going to get into the Boilers later in the show and just how I think they could be one of the more undervalued teams in not only the Big Ten, but really in all of college basketball based on the season that they have had so far. I've been really impressed with Matt Painter and the job that he has done. But yeah, I do like Ohio State to earn the victory over Minnesota in round 2 of this Big Ten tournament, and I do have the Buckeyes going to the quarterfinals, taking on Purdue. E.J. Liddell is one member of my first team all Big Ten conference squad. And look, the Buckeyes just need to be a little bit better offensively. Dwayne Washington, Justice Suing, C.J. Walker, their job is to put the ball in the bucket. I love Liddell. I think he is legitimately the best player for a really good Ohio State team, and I could watch him ball each and every night. I do like Ohio State and the Buckeyes to beat Minnesota and to move on to face Purdue. Moving on to the next game in the Big Ten. This is going to be a good one. We have the number 10 seed, Indiana Hoosiers, taking on the number 7 seed, Rutgers Scarlet Knights. And Indiana is a team that we have to get into when we discuss the Big Ten. And I feel like Indiana basketball has a lot of similarities to Tennessee football, a program that, if we're looking at it from 30, 40 years ago, they are one of the premier programs in college basketball. And I do consider the Indiana Hoosiers a blue blood based on so much history they have with Bob Knight, all that good stuff. However, since Bob Knight has left and that one deep run to the national championship game in 2002, let's face facts, guys. Indiana basketball hasn't been very good. And I do think Tom Crean didn't necessarily get the best and most fair share there as the head coach of the Hoosiers. But at the same time, I will say this. I had a very strong feeling that bringing in Archie Miller was a hire that they really couldn't do better than that. We saw what a coach like Archie Miller was able to do at Dayton, beating out a very good Syracuse team, leading them to the Elite Eight, and consistently having the Dayton Flyers on top of the Big Ten. But unfortunately, at Indiana, it's going to be 4 years, and unless they don't win this Big Ten tournament, 0 years of making the NCAA tournament. Now, I understand if the tournament would have happened last year, Indiana would have probably made it. But let's face facts. Archie Miller is going to be the first coach in the history of Indiana Hoosier basketball to start off his tenure as Hoosier coach for the first 4 years without a winning season in terms of Big Ten conference games. He is going to finish with an under 500 record in the Big Ten throughout his first 4 years as head coach of the Hoosiers. And that is why I'm not buying the people who say, oh, wow, Archie Miller, he should have made the tournament during his third year, but it got canceled because of the pandemic, and that is why he deserves to keep his job. The reason I don't buy that is because, number one, it's not like Indiana was comfortably in. It's not like they were a top 25 team consistently for the whole season. But at the same time, Indiana, it's not like they should be this bad this season as well, because Indiana, early on in the season, I actually was feeling pretty good about this team. I saw Trace Jackson-Davis as legitimately one of the best players in the Big Ten. I saw Race Thompson as one of the more improved players in the Big Ten. How about Armaan Franklin? He is actually the winner of my most improved player in the Big Ten award. I think he has really been, along with Trace Jackson-Davis, the one bright spot for this Indiana Hoosier team, and you could tell he has missed 5 games this season. Indiana is a different team without him. His jump from last year to this year, he has improved his scoring by 8 points, jumping from 3.7 to 11.6, and his rebounding numbers by 3 as well. Once again, you could just totally tell Indiana is a different team when he is not in the lineup. Al Durham, Rob Finney, Jerome Hunter, even some of the younger guys like Trey Galloway, Jordan Geronimo, Christian Lander, who reclassified and I thought was going to be one of the main contributors for this Indiana Hoosier team. Unfortunately, that didn't really work out. But look, Indiana should not be this bad, and they really do remind me of Minnesota. They were a team that early on in the season, I was looking at the Hoosiers and was feeling pretty comfortable that they were going to be an NCAA tournament team. I mean, let's not forget, everyone loves Iowa, and yes, we're going to get into the Hawkeyes a little bit later and just how phenomenal of a season Luca Garza has been having. But guys, at the same time, let's not forget that the Indiana Hoosiers beat Iowa not only once, no, not just only once, but twice as well in a really, really, really nice game there for the Hoosiers, especially the second time. That was a really nice effort. You also look at Indiana. They beat Minnesota. They had a nice win against Maryland, had a nice win against Stanford during non-con play. They blew out Providence as well. There were many times during the early portion of this season where I was actually out here watching Indiana and saying to myself, wow, maybe they actually aren't that bad because of a guy like Armaan Franklin and his improvement, but nah, they're going to be entering this Big Ten tournament as losers of 5 games in a row. And I'll admit it, when you are the head coach of Indiana and you are a fan supporting Indiana basketball, your team has to be better than this. Losing 5 games in a row, going into the Big Ten tournament, that is unacceptable. Archie Miller has also never beaten Purdue as the head coach of Indiana. That is obviously never going to help your cause when you are trying to get on the fans' good side. So it has just been an absolute disaster of a season for Indiana, especially when you consider the fact that when the season started, they didn't really look that bad. They looked like a team that could have some potential. Unfortunately, as we all know, it hasn't worked out. Indiana is the 10th seed. They will be taking on the number 7-seeded Rutgers Scarlet Knights. And I remember when the NCAA tournament was canceled last year, I just remember saying to myself, wow, like you have a team like Rutgers who is going to their first NCAA tournament in ages. It was going to be their first NCAA tournament since the 90s. And they unfortunately did not have the chance to play in it. And I do think that they were robbed. And last year, they were so good at home. We saw just how big of an advantage the RAC was for this Rutgers Scarlet Knights team, and they used it to their advantage, and it got them all the way to the NCAA tournament. And one of the main questions that a lot of people had about this Rutgers team going into the season was when you look at the fact that their home court advantage, even though the games are going to be at the same place, it's just not going to be the same because there are going to be no fans. Like, how are they going to be at home? And they weren't as good at home as they were last year when they only lost one game. But at the same time, there were many moments where they used their home court to their advantage. And there were many home games for this Rutgers team throughout this season against big, quality opponents in the Big Ten. And they were able to win enough of those games to get themselves into the tournament. That includes a win against Syracuse, a win against Illinois, a win against Purdue, a win against Michigan State, a win against Indiana as well. They also went on the road to Minnesota and won on Saturday. Once again, that was a game they really could have lost and could have blown. They went to Indiana and won. They went to Maryland and won. That was the other big win for Rutgers early on in Big Ten play. And let's just not diminish the job that Steve Pikiell has done since he's taken over as the head coach of Rutgers. There is many different guys on this Rutgers team that has the ability to beat you. I love the depth of this team, whether it's Ron Harper, a guard who has really come into his own this season. Now, he started the season red hot. Unfortunately, he has cooled off a little bit, but he is a guy that late in the game I absolutely do trust with the ball in his hands. They also have Jacob Young, the transfer from Texas, playing in his second season with this Rutgers Scarlet Knights program. He averaged 14.5 points per game this season, really showed me what he could do as an offensive creator with a little bit more of an opportunity. Geo Baker is a legend for this Rutgers program. He got hurt early on in the season. He hasn't been bad, but he just hasn't necessarily been the same player that we've seen over the last couple of years. And Miles Johnson is one of the more underrated players in not only the Big Ten, but all of college basketball. He is a rebounding machine, and he is just a true center that impacts the game in so many different ways. Now, Indiana and Rutgers, I think that these two teams are similar in the fact that they don't really play the most efficient basketball. When you watch their games, eventually they do end up turning into rock fights most of the time. But I do think when you look at Indiana, they are the most disappointing team in the Big Ten officially. They won my award for that. And when you look at the fact that they have lost 5 games in a row heading into this Big Ten tournament, there's no real reason for me to pick them to beat anyone, let alone a pretty good Rutgers team that I know is going to want to create some momentum heading into March Madness. Rutgers was able to beat Indiana twice during the regular season, including at Assembly Hall. We all know, as I spoke about with my guy Chad yesterday during the ACC portion of the podcast, just how hard it is to beat a team 3 times in a season. So yes, I do like Rutgers moving on and beating Indiana. So let's move on in the bracket. I did select the number 11 seed Penn State to move on against Nebraska. They would take on the number 6 seed Wisconsin Badgers. And I do think you could make an argument that Wisconsin, besides Indiana obviously, are one of the more disappointing teams in this Big Ten. And I predicted Greg Gard and this Wisconsin Badger team to win the Big Ten for the second year in a row. But I think as time has got on, we have really seen why exactly Wisconsin was able to go into last year's Big Ten tournament as one of the more hotter teams in all of college basketball, and they just could not miss from 3. And I thought that going into this season, when you combined how they were able to end last season with their ability to shoot the ball and their experience, I actually thought this Wisconsin team was setting up to be the best bet to win this Big Ten in such a crowded league just because they had so much experience playing against each other. But at the same time, when you've watched Wisconsin this season, I think they are a prime example of a team that just has too much experience, and there aren't necessarily that many guys that have the ability to get better. We just know how many games, in big games I'm talking, Demetric Trice, Brad Davison, Micah Potter, Nate Reavers, guys like that. We know how many big games they've played in throughout their Wisconsin Badger career. However, at the same time, it's not like they're getting any better. And Demetric Trice has had a phenomenal season. I think he's really done a good job taking over as the top dog in this Wisconsin offense, and he hasn't really gotten that much help. I think the one guy that has really regressed from seasons past is Nate Reavers, and I'm a huge fan of his game throughout his first 3 years of college. I love the trajectory that he was going in, continually getting better and better and better for the Wisconsin Badgers, but unfortunately this season, compared to some years past, it just hasn't necessarily been the same. He's averaging 8.5 points per game, 3.3 rebounds per game, 24.6% from three, and he is the Wisconsin Badgers' fifth leading scorer. That is not a successful formula if you are a team like Wisconsin that wants to win as many college basketball games as possible. They're going to need for him to be better than that if they want to win basketball games. And the one kid that I didn't mention yet for Wisconsin that I really like, that I think has a chance to be a star in years to come, is Jonathan Davis. He only is averaging 7 points, 4.2 rebounds, 1 assist per game, 36.4% from three. I think his three-point shot is only going to develop and get better. But I'm a huge fan of his game, and I do think that Wisconsin needs more guys like him in the program to develop and get better. And as great of a run as it's been for guys like Dimitri Trice and guys like Brad Davison and guys like Nate Reavers, I think we are seeing that this season is coming to an end. And I understand why Badger fans aren't particularly very happy with Greg Gard as a head coach right now, but let's not forget, this guy really overachieved with Wisconsin last season before the pandemic hit. You guys do realize that going into last season, I wasn't too high on Wisconsin at all. I think that 2 years ago, we saw the Badgers, a team that just was a prime example of relying way too much on a guy like Ethan Happ. And I love Ethan Happ's game, and he was the perfect college player, especially for a team like Wisconsin. But I saw that he wasn't really able to get enough help from guys like Trice and guys like Davison. And maybe how much Wisconsin really had to rely on Ethan Happ in such a Big Ten, I think maybe that's affected the development of some of those guys, especially Davison. I mean, look, I don't want to sit here and say he's a bad player. He's certainly effective, especially on the defensive side of the ball. He has a reason for you to play him, but 9.2 points per game, 37.2% from three. Those are good numbers, but I don't know. I just think he would have made a bigger impact as a senior, and maybe he could still do that in the Big Ten tournament. But Wisconsin has had many opportunities this season against good teams at home in spots where you expect them to win, and unfortunately they just have not been able to get the job done at all. A couple weeks ago, Saturday home game, senior day against Illinois, and if you would have thought going into this game, Wisconsin, they're a team full of seniors. Going into that game against Illinois, they'd lost at home to Iowa. They'd lost at home to Michigan. They had lost some home games that really not a lot of people expected them to lose. They lost to Ohio State at home as well. Wisconsin, they'd struggled in big games at home. And against Illinois on senior day, with the Illini playing in their first game without Ayo Dosunmu, this was a big spot where I could have expected the Badgers to just come out and get the victory against a shorthanded Illinois team. And not only did they lose, they ended up losing by 5, but the score, if you really watch the game, did not accurately show just how close the game really was. Dimitri Trice went on to score about the last 19 points of the game or so for the Wisconsin Badgers, and they are going to need more than that if they are going to want to win games against good teams. And Wisconsin is in trouble right now. I think they are a team that going into March Madness is trending in the wrong direction, and they are another team in this Big Ten. Maybe they just fallen victim of a tough Big Ten schedule and just how tough of a league the Big Ten is overall. But if they want to go on any kind of a run in March, they're going to have to create some momentum. I think they will at least start by creating some, getting the victory over Penn State, and moving on to take on the number 3 seed Iowa Hawkeyes. Let's move on to the quarterfinals of the Big Ten, and I had Michigan State, the number 9 seed, moving on and taking on the number 1 seed, Michigan Wolverines. And let's talk a little bit about Michigan, because I really can't say enough about the job Juwan Howard has done so far this season as the head coach of the Wolverines, and really last season. I think Juwan Howard has really made Michigan fans and the transition, I should say, from John Beilein to Juwan Howard. Michigan fans forget even about John Beilein because of how good of a job Juwan Howard has done and how good of a job he's done really, I think, transforming the program. He's done such a phenomenal job really keeping a lot of the good things that John Beilein did while also adding in his own wrinkle of things and making Michigan a place where big-time recruits are really going to want to play. They have the best recruiting class in all of college basketball next year. That should tell us just how scary this program is going to be under Juwan Howard for years to come. But let's talk a little bit about this year's Michigan Wolverines. And I'll admit, going into the season, I was not too high on Michigan because last year I saw just how important guys like Xavier Simpson and John Teskey were to the Wolverines as a team, and I didn't necessarily know if they were going to have enough guys to help them get over the hump. I knew that Hunter Dickinson was a very highly ranked recruit, and I knew about Mike Smith and how he was the leading scorer in the Ivy League last year, just putting up insane numbers at Columbia. But at the same time, I just didn't know when you compared Michigan to your Indianas and your Ohio States and your Minnesotas of the world, Rutgers, Michigan State, other teams in that mix, I didn't really know if they would have enough to be able to leap those teams, and boy, did they do a good job proving me wrong, as really, they were the most consistent team in the Big Ten throughout conference play. Juwan Howard is the winner of the Big Ten Coach of the Year award for me. It's really not even close. The job that he has done turning around this program has been super, super impressive. And Hunter Dickinson is also my Big Ten Freshman of the Year. You forget sometimes with the job defensively this guy has been able to do on Luca Garza, the job that he was able to do against Ohio State, really impacting that game. He also did a good job on the two big men, Potter and Reavers, against Wisconsin. I think he's had a phenomenal season. And guys like Franz Wagner, he has really started to peak for Michigan over the last couple games. If Michigan wants to go all the way to the Final Four, which I think they can, Michigan is going to need a guy like Franz Wagner to step up and really play his best basketball, because I think when he is playing his best basketball, he looks like a guy that has a bright, bright future in the NBA. Isaiah Livers is another guy on this Michigan team that has been around for a really, really long time, has plenty of experience playing in big games, and I think he is another guy that could do a lot to help this Michigan team win as many games as possible in this Big Ten tournament. The one small concern I have for Michigan, it's not even the fact that they lost to Michigan State the other day. They already had the Big Ten title basically set in stone, wrapped up after they completed the win against Michigan State the other night, but it is the fact that Eli Brooks got hurt in that game against Michigan State, and Eli Brooks is a guy that as he's gotten older throughout his college career, I think Michigan fans have realized not only just how good of a player he is on the defensive side of the ball, but just how improved he's gotten and really just how important he is to the Michigan Wolverines as a team. I think he is a guy that could make a big-time impact when he's out there on the floor, putting him on the other team's best player. If he is out for a long term and he has a little bit of an issue, it is unknown right now if he's going to play in the Big Ten tournament. Shawnee Brown is a guy, a transfer from Wake Forest, that I think does have the ability to step up. But at the same time, when you're playing in such a tough league like the Big Ten, you're going to want to be 100% healthy. I do think Michigan State does enough I do think Michigan does enough to beat Michigan State in this rivalry matchup in the quarterfinals of the Big Ten tournament. I think it's going to be a great game. Hunter Dickinson, once again, my freshman of the year. Juwan Howard, once again, my coach of the year. I think, once again, we could talk a lot about just how great of a job both of these guys have done this season, really turning Michigan into a place where many players across college basketball want to play. Michigan and Michigan State, it is going to be, if they do end up playing the third time they play in a little less than 2 weeks, these two teams are now very familiar with each other. I think Michigan does enough. But Michigan State's a tournament team, and Tom Izzo, once again, doing a great job in March. Moving on to the next matchup in the Big Ten, I told you that I had the number 5 seed Ohio State Buckeyes moving on against Minnesota, and I have them going to game number 8 of this Big Ten tournament against Purdue. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the Boilermakers, because I think you can make an argument that they are right now one of the most undervalued teams in college basketball going into conference tournament week. And Purdue is a team that when you watch them, they don't really do anything flashy, but they are tough. They're in your face. And when you have a coach like Matt Painter, who all he has done has been winning throughout his career as the head coach of Purdue, there was no reason to expect this Purdue team to not be good. And really, since the start of the new year, they had a game on January 5th, postponed because of COVID, against Nebraska. Since that game, they have a record of 10-3 in a league like the Big Ten, which is very, very tough. Those include wins on the road against Ohio State. How about this one? A win on the road against Penn State, a win at home against Michigan State, a win at home against Indiana, win at home against Wisco, a win at home against Notre Dame, a win at home against Michigan State, and Purdue has been playing some phenomenal basketball. And I'll give you guys another member of my first team All Big Ten squad that I don't think is getting enough attention to how good of a season he's had, and that is Treyvion Williams, the big man of Purdue, averaging 5.2 points per game, 8.8 rebounds per game, 2 assists per game, doesn't even think about ever shooting a three-pointer. He is the definition of a traditional back-to-the-basket big man, which if you are a fan of the Purdue Boilermakers, you know that your program has made a living of developing those guys over the last couple of seasons. The other thing I really like about this Purdue Boilermakers team that I think they have going for them is they have a number of different guards that could beat you, and it's not like they really rely on any of them to do a lot. Jayden Ivy is the one that stands out in particular. He is actually the Boilermakers' second leading scorer, averaging 10 points per game, 3.4 rebounds per game, only shooting 22.4% from three, but I do think that number is only going to go up and up and up as he gets older. Sasha Stefanovic is another guy. He has been in and out of the lineup due to COVID, but I do think when he is in the lineup, Purdue is capable of beating more than anyone. Eric Hunter Jr. and Aaron Wheeler were the two guys that I had my eyes on for this Purdue team going into the season. I remember saying on this podcast multiple times that, hey, there was going to be a very good chance Purdue's season really does rely on just how good and just how effective those two players are. Zach Edey, the 7'4" freshman big man, very tough to stop. I'm curious to see how using a guy like him in the Big Ten tournament, a guy that is just significantly bigger than really every other defender in this league, I'm curious to see how and if Purdue is going to be able to use him to their advantage. But look, Matt Painter, he is one of the most underrated coaches in college basketball. All he does is win games, and not a lot of people talk about him. Not enough people are really talking about this Purdue team and how much better I think they've gotten throughout the course of the regular season. And this is a Purdue team that is still recovering from that great class they lost a couple years ago that made it all the way to the Elite Eight with Carson Edwards, with Matt Harms, who transferred, guys like that, Ryan Klein as well. And Purdue was able to make the Elite Eight with that team. And look, playing in a league like the Big Ten, I understand it's super tough, but I am going to predict Purdue to move on in this Big Ten quarterfinal to take on Michigan. I have them beating Ohio State. And if you ask me why, I'm just going to keep on going back to the fact that I think you can make an argument Purdue right now is one of the more undervalued teams in all of college basketball. I don't think enough people are paying attention to just how good of a last couple of weeks these Boilermakers have been having. And once again, I just love not only that they're tough, not only that they play defense, but they have so many different guys from the perimeter along with the two big men in Williams and Edey. They're pretty consistent. You really know what you're going to be getting from them on a day-in, day-out basis. I'm really fascinated by this Purdue Boilermakers team. I like them to beat Ohio State in game number 8 and move on to the semifinals of the Big Ten tournament. Moving on to game number 9. I told you that I have Rutgers moving on and beating Indiana in game number 5. They will be taken on in game number 9, the number 2 seeded Illinois fighting Illini, and the Illini have been one of the most hottest teams in all of college basketball over the last couple of weeks, and I think that really Brad Underwood and their whole program deserves so much credit for really how quickly they've been able to turn it around. There have been so many times throughout recent memory in college basketball where I'm watching a team like Illinois, and this is 2 years ago, I'll put you in the time machine, and I'm watching Illinois, and I see, wow, they have a really good young guard in Ayo Dosunmu. I knew what Trent Frazier was about. I knew that Georgi Bashanishvili was a good young big man that was developing and only getting better. I love Brad Underwood and what he's been able to do as a head coach, really doing a great job of showing us his ability to turn around programs into winners, and that is exactly what he's been able to do so far as the head coach of Illinois. And in the last 2 years, Illinois overnight has turned into a contender, and I think Illinois is a team that when we watch college basketball as fans of the sport, we can all agree in saying that college basketball is a better product when a team like Illinois is good and is producing and is relevant. We remember just back in 2005 when they made it all the way to the national championship game. They were one win away and ended up losing to Roy Williams and North Carolina. That was just a insane UNC team. I don't think there were going to be many teams across college basketball that were ever going to beat them. But Illinois is a team that's interesting because when you look at the Illini, throughout the early portion of the season, they struggled a little bit. They had a loss against Missouri on the road. They had a loss against Rutgers on the road. They had a loss against Ohio State, a loss against Michigan State. But really, besides those couple hiccups, they've done a phenomenal job winning games. And especially over the last 8 weeks, they've picked up some monster wins, including a home win against Iowa, a home win against Wisconsin, a road win against Indiana, a road win against Minnesota, a road win against Wisconsin, a road win against Michigan without Ayo Dosunmu, first team to beat Michigan in a couple months there, and a away win at Ohio State. And the one thing I love about Illinois, especially watching them over the last couple weeks, is that they are starting to get contributions from many different players. And I actually said it at the time. I did a whole segment on this on my podcast. It's on YouTube. You could actually check it out. I said Ayo Dosunmu getting hurt for Illinois wasn't necessarily going to be the worst thing in the world because I thought it would actually give other guys a little bit bigger of an opportunity to step up, to make plays late, and I think that is exactly what happened. Andre Curbelo has looked so confident over the last couple weeks with the ball in his hands, especially in big moments. Trent Frazier has been a little bit inconsistent, but let's face facts. Trent Frazier, his first year at Illinois, the program was in such a bad spot that they were really relying on him as a freshman to be their one primary creator and create shots and make shots, and unfortunately, he was able to get the job done for the most part, but he was able to take a backseat to Ayo Dosunmu and say, look, okay, the program is in a better place with you as the top dog. I'm willing to buy into a new role, and on some nights he'll have 22 like he did against Michigan in the win on last Tuesday night. But at the same time, I think if Illinois wants to get to a Final Four, which after watching them throughout many points of the season, I think they can, they're going to need him to be one of their big-time main contributors. He was phenomenal in their win against Indiana as well, an overtime win, dropping 19 in that game. The other player I really like for this Illinois Fighting Illini team is Kofi Coburn, one of the biggest matchup problems in the Big Ten, and he is just so tough to guard. He really did a nice job against Michigan, really did a nice job against Ohio State, as Illinois, I thought, really was able to use their physicality to their advantage. I was very impressed with what they were able to do there, and then they were also able to go into Minnesota and win. Look, Illinois has won many big games throughout the season. They have a guy in Kofi Coburn that creates a very unique matchup problem. They have a guy like Ayo Dosunmu, who is the next member of my first team All Big Ten squad. He's going to join E.J. Liddell, Treyvion Williams, and Hunter Dickinson. I'm sure you guys could figure out who the fifth member of the Big Ten is next, as we will be going over his team next. I like Illinois a lot. I think they beat Rutgers. I think they are a team that could get to the Final Four. I think they are the team in the Big Ten that is playing the best basketball out of anyone, which is a really scary sight when you consider the fact that they just got their best player back a couple weeks ago, and it didn't look like they ever missed a beat without him. Okay, let's go over the last and final team in the Big Ten that we haven't gone over yet. That would be the number 3 seed, Fran McCaffrey, and his Iowa Hawkeyes. I picked Wisconsin to beat Penn State and be their opponent. Let's talk a little bit about Iowa. And look, I totally understand why going into this college basketball season, a team like Iowa had the hype they did. I think we all feel very comfortable in saying Luca Garza is the best player in college basketball. Not only is he the 5th member of my first team All Big Ten team, but he was also my winner of Big Ten Player of the Year, and his numbers this season were absolutely absurd, putting up 23.8 points per game, 8.7 rebounds per game, shooting 43% from 3, and it was announced after the game the other night against Wisconsin that he would be getting his number retired. Really good stuff there. It's very rare you see that. A player literally just after his senior day, they just announced, okay, your number is getting retired. It just shows you how highly regarded he is around the Iowa program. Now, look, it hasn't been the easiest season for the Hawkeyes. They have had some ups and they've had some downs, just like many other teams in college basketball. There were times this season, like against North Carolina, where they literally could not miss from 3 when we were watching these Iowa Hawkeyes and saying, okay, wow, maybe this team is special. These guys are literally the Golden State Warriors. Maybe they can make a run to the Final Four. The reason why I was always skeptical of Iowa was the fact that when you look at their coach and you just look at his tournament track record, I'm not saying he's done a bad job, but he has had a tough time leading this group of Hawkeyes deep in NCAA tournaments. As a matter of fact, he has never made it past the Sweet 16. And I think if you are a fan of the Iowa Hawkeyes, then that is definitely a concern, because I do think there are plenty of Iowa fans who, even though they do appreciate Fran McCaffrey and everything that he's been able to do over the years, this is his best chance to get to a Final Four. This team is really good. This team, I feel comfortable in saying, is one of the best teams in college basketball. And by the way, McCaffrey has never made a Sweet 16. The furthest he's been in is the second round. So this is a big opportunity for Coach Fran McCaffrey to show a lot of people around college basketball that he has the ability to win in the NCAA tournament. Now, Iowa's fallen victims, just like many other teams in this league, of a tough Big Ten. They lost on the road to Michigan by a lot, lost to Illinois on the road, lost to Indiana twice, lost to Ohio State at home. They also got blown out by Gonzaga. That was the first time when it hit a lot of people like, wow, maybe these Iowa Hawkeyes just aren't necessarily as good as everyone thinks they are. But hey, they are going to be a team that I think right now is comfortably on the 2 line. They have many different guys that could beat you that are all experienced. Joe Wieskamp is the one concern for Iowa right now. He averages 15 points, 6.6 rebounds per game, 1.5 assists per game, and Fran McCaffrey has the reputation as a head coach. He's a guy that if there's anything that has the ability to take any of his players off the floor, whether it's foul trouble, whether it is injuries, he is always going to let them take their time and not rush them. And that is exactly what I see happening with Joe Wieskamp in this situation. I do not expect him to play in this Big Ten tournament, but that gives you guys like Jordan Bohannon, that gives you guys like CJ Frederick the ability to really beat you. Joe Toussaint, the 2 McCaffrey kids as well, they have the ability to step in. Unfortunately, it sucks what happened to Jack Nungy as well, a guy who really had a tough offseason heading into this year with his father passing away, but he did a great job really being able to recover on the basketball floor. You were able to see just how much getting on the basketball floor meant to him and how much it really affected him. And it just sucks what happened to this Iowa team. They couldn't catch a break, but they're going to need a guy like Keegan Murray or a guy like Joe Toussaint or even a guy like Tony Perkins to step up now that they're getting a little bit more of an opportunity. I actually like Wisconsin to pull the upset over Iowa. It's been all chalk so far. I've actually done a nice job profiting against Iowa in their losses this season, but at the same time, when you look at the Wisconsin Badgers, it is very hard for me to feel comfortable picking them to win a big game right now, especially against an Iowa offense that is absolutely electric. But with that being said, Iowa and Wisconsin played on Sunday, and Wisconsin, it was their best game played in a while. I understand they didn't win, but I do think it was the first time in a while where if you're a Wisconsin fan, you actually could have gotten some excitement watching your team, and they played better than I think, once again, you could have ever expected. I do like Wisconsin to pull the upset over Iowa. Semifinals, I like Michigan to beat Purdue. I just think the Wolverines are better, and I like Illinois to beat Wisconsin. I think that Michigan and Illinois, their fans have been in a little bit of beef on Twitter over who actually won the Big Ten because they didn't necessarily play the same amount of games. So I think it is all but right that we see Illinois and Michigan play in the Big Ten tournament final. And I'm actually going to pick the Illinois Fighting Illini to win the Big Ten tournament. I think they are playing by far and away the best basketball out of anyone in the Big Ten. I think that Brad Underwood and his guys have been waiting for this moment, and I think that Brad Underwood and his guys are waiting to send a message to say, hey, we just went into your building without Ayo Dosunmu and beat you by a lot. I think we could do it again. Not trying to diminish Juwan Howard and the job he's done so far, obviously. I'll be curious to see how Michigan responds. Hopefully Eli Brooks will be healthy and ready to go. I can't undersell how important he is to the Wolverines team. But with that being said, yeah, I like Illinois winning this absolutely loaded Big Ten tournament. So before I get out of here, I'll recap everything. In round one of the Big Ten tournament, I like Minnesota over Northwestern. I like Penn State over Nebraska. Round two, give me Michigan State over Maryland. Give me Ohio State over Minnesota. Give me Rutgers over Indiana. Give me Wisco over Penn State. Give me Michigan over Michigan State to start off the quarterfinals. I'll take Purdue over Ohio State. I'll take Illinois over Rutgers. I'll take Wisconsin to pull the first major upset of the tournament to beat Iowa. I'll take Michigan over Purdue. I'll take Illinois over Wisconsin, and give me the Fighting Illini to win the Big Ten. To recap the awards one more time in the Big Ten, Luca Garza, my Big Ten Player of the Year. Juwan Howard from Michigan, my Coach of the Year. Hunter Dickinson from Michigan, my Freshman of the Year. My biggest disappointment in the Big Ten, Indiana. My first team All-Conference Big Ten squad, Ayo Dosunmu from Illinois. E.J. Liddell from Ohio State. Treyvion Williams from Purdue. Hunter Dickinson from Michigan. Luca Garza from Iowa. And my most improved player in the Big Ten is Armaan Franklin of Indiana. I just wanted to say, guys, thank you again so much for listening. The conference tournaments this week have been great, recording a podcast for each one, breaking it down with all of you guys. We will be back later tonight recording the Big 12, and we will be getting ready for conference tournament week and March Madness as time goes on. Thank you guys so much for listening. Stay safe and have a good one.